Marcus Thornfield stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, gazing down at the city that sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom. As CEO of Thornfield Industries, a multinational corporation worth billions, he had everything a man could desire: wealth, power, and influence that reached into the highest echelons of society. His suits were custom-tailored in Milan, his watches worth more than most people's homes, and his decisions affected thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. But Marcus had grown cold over the years, his heart hardened by the relentless pursuit of profit and shareholder value. He had forgotten what it meant to be human, to feel compassion for those beneath him in the corporate hierarchy. On that particular Tuesday morning, Marcus had arrived at the office in a foul mood. Traffic had delayed him by 15 minutes, an unacceptable inconvenience for a man of his stature. As he strode through the gleaming marble lobby, his Italian leather shoes clicking authoritatively against the floor, he noticed a wet spot near the elevator bank. His face flushed with anger as he stepped around it, nearly slipping in the process. "Security," he barked, his voice echoing through the atrium. "Who is responsible for this hazard?" Within minutes, a small, elderly man appeared, mop and bucket in hand. His name was George Martinez, a janitor who had worked at Thornfield Industries for nearly 20 years. George's weathered face showed the marks of a hard life, but his eyes were kind, and he took pride in keeping the building immaculate. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornfield," George said quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the mop handle. "The morning cleaning crew called in sick, and I was trying to cover all the floors myself. I must have missed the spot." Marcus looked at George with contempt, seeing not a dedicated employee who had served the company faithfully for 2 decades, but only an obstacle to his perfect day, a symbol of inefficiency. "Missed it," Marcus spat. "You nearly caused me to fall. Do you have any idea what my time is worth? What if I had been injured?" George opened his mouth to apologize again, but Marcus cut him off with a dismissive wave. "I don't want to hear excuses. You're fired. Security will escort you out. Collect your things and leave the premises immediately." The gathered employees in the lobby watched in stunned silence as George's face crumpled. "Mr. Thornfield, please," George pleaded, his voice breaking. "I have a wife with medical bills, a daughter in college. I've worked here for 20 years without incident. Please give me another chance." But Marcus had already turned away, stepping into his private elevator without a backward glance, George's desperate pleas falling on deaf ears as the doors slid shut with a quiet whisper of finality. The months following George's dismissal were marked by Marcus's continued success, at least on the surface. Thornfield Industries posted record profits, and Marcus received accolades from business magazines and industry associations. Yet something had shifted imperceptibly in his world. Small things began to go wrong. Minor cracks in the facade of his perfect life that he dismissed as coincidence or the incompetence of others. His wife, Catherine, grew distant, spending more time at their vacation home in the Hamptons than at their penthouse in the city. When Marcus bothered to notice, he attributed it to her shopping habits or social calendar, never considering that she might be lonely or unhappy in their marriage. At the office, Marcus's aggressive cost-cutting measures and ruthless management style began to take their toll. Key executives started leaving for competitors, citing the toxic work environment. The board of directors, once unanimous in their support, began to question his decisions in private meetings. Whispers of discontent echoed through the corporate hallways, but Marcus remained oblivious, insulated by his arrogance and surrounded by yes-men who were too afraid to speak truth to power. He pushed harder, demanded more, and showed less mercy to those who failed to meet his increasingly unrealistic expectations. "Excellence," he would proclaim at quarterly meetings, "is not negotiable. Those who cannot keep up will be left behind." The true beginning of Marcus's downfall came not from external market forces or competitive pressures, but from within his own organization. An ambitious vice president named Richard Chen had been quietly documenting Marcus's questionable accounting practices and ethical violations for months. Marcus had been shifting funds between subsidiaries, inflating revenue projections, and engaging in insider trading that bordered on illegal. Richard had endured Marcus's abuse and witnessed his cruelty toward employees, including George's termination, and he had finally had enough. Armed with evidence of financial misconduct, Richard approached the board of directors with his findings, triggering an immediate internal investigation. The investigation moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Within weeks, forensic accountants had uncovered a web of financial irregularities that implicated Marcus directly. The board moved to distance themselves from the scandal, suspending Marcus pending further review. The media seized upon the story with ravenous hunger, and suddenly Marcus Thornfield, once celebrated as a titan of industry, became the face of corporate greed and corruption. His fall from grace was spectacular and public, splashed across newspaper headlines and television news programs. Federal regulators launched their own investigation, freezing his assets and filing charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Catherine filed for divorce within days, taking their 2 children and moving back to her family's estate. In a matter of months, Marcus lost everything: his position, his wealth, his family, and his freedom, as he was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for his crimes. The Federal Correctional Facility was a harsh awakening for a man who had spent decades in luxury. Marcus entered prison as inmate number 47832, stripped of his identity, his designer suits replaced with ill-fitting orange jumpsuits. The concrete walls, the metal bars, the constant noise and lack of privacy were suffocating. But worse than the physical deprivation was the psychological torment of falling from such great heights. Marcus had nightmares where he was back in his corner office, only to wake to the reality of his 6-by-8-foot cell, shared with a cellmate who snored loudly and showed him no deference whatsoever. In prison, Marcus was nobody special. The other inmates didn't care about his former status or achievements. If anything, they resented him as a symbol of the corporate elite who had never faced consequences until now. He was harassed, threatened, and forced to learn humility the hard way. The guards showed him no special treatment, and the prison work assignments were grueling and demeaning. Marcus was assigned to the kitchen, scrubbing pots and mopping floors, ironically, the same type of work George had done at Thornfield Industries. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he tried to suppress the guilty feelings that occasionally surfaced when he remembered the old janitor's face on that terrible morning. The first 2 years were the hardest. Marcus struggled with depression and anger, railing against the injustice of his situation while simultaneously knowing that he had brought it upon himself. He received no visits from Catherine or his children, who wanted nothing to do with him. His former colleagues and friends abandoned him entirely, unwilling to associate with a convicted felon. The isolation was crushing, and Marcus contemplated ending his life on more than one occasion. But something kept him going, perhaps a stubborn refusal to surrender completely, or maybe a small spark of hope that he might somehow rebuild his life when he was released. In his 3rd year of incarceration, something unexpected happened. An older inmate named Jimmy, who had served 20 years for armed robbery, befriended Marcus. Jimmy had found religion in prison and spent his time counseling younger inmates and leading Bible study groups. Despite Marcus's initial resistance, Jimmy's patient kindness slowly began to penetrate the walls Marcus had built around his heart. Through their conversations, Marcus began to confront the reality of who he had become before his arrest: a cruel, selfish man who had valued money and status above human dignity. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt genuine remorse for his actions, not just regret at being caught, but true sorrow for the pain he had caused others. He thought often of George Martinez and the callousness of his termination, wondering what had become of the old janitor and wishing he could somehow make amends for his cruelty. Marcus emerged from prison on a cold November morning after serving nearly 5 years, having earned early release for good behavior. He was 53 years old, but he looked a decade older. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines etched his face, and his body had become thin and frail despite the prison workouts. He stepped through the gates carrying a small bag containing his few possessions, some clothes, a few books Jimmy had given him, and $37 in cash. The world he re-entered was both familiar and alien. Technology had advanced, the city had changed, and he had no place in it anymore. Marcus had nowhere to go. Catherine had sold their penthouse and vacation homes, keeping the proceeds as part of the divorce settlement. His parents were deceased, and he had been an only child. His few relatives had cut off contact during the trial, ashamed of the scandal. He spent his first night out of prison in a homeless shelter, lying on a cot surrounded by dozens of other men who had fallen through society's cracks. The shelter was crowded, noisy, and smelled of unwashed bodies and desperation. As Marcus lay there staring at the ceiling, he realized with crushing finality that this was his new reality. He was homeless, penniless, and unemployable with his criminal record. The stark difference between his former life and his current circumstances was almost incomprehensible. The following days were a blur of rejection and humiliation. Marcus attempted to find work, any work, but his criminal record and the notoriety of his case made him toxic to potential employers. Even fast food restaurants and retail stores turned him away once they ran background checks. He tried using false names, but the gaps in his employment history and his lack of recent references raised immediate red flags. Without a job, he couldn't secure housing. Without housing, finding employment became even more difficult. Marcus found himself trapped in the vicious cycle that ensnares so many people trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration. As weeks turned into months, Marcus became just another face in the homeless population that inhabited the city's streets. He learned the locations of soup kitchens, which shelters had space available on different nights, where he could find free clothing, and which street corners were best for panhandling. Pride, which had once been his defining characteristic, became a luxury he could no longer afford. He stood on busy street corners with a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless. Anything helps. God bless." Pedestrians rushed past, most avoiding eye contact, some dropping coins or dollar bills into the coffee cup he held with trembling hands. Each act of charity was both a blessing and a humiliation, a reminder of how far he had fallen and how completely he had failed to rebuild his life after prison. 3 years passed, then 4, then 5. Marcus became a fixture in the downtown area, his face weathered and bearded, his clothes donated and threadbare. He celebrated his 58th birthday alone under a highway overpass, marking another year of survival in circumstances he never could have imagined during his former life. The streets were unforgiving, especially as he aged. Winters were brutal, and Marcus suffered from chronic bronchitis and arthritis that made every movement painful. He had witnessed the deaths of several fellow homeless individuals from exposure, overdoses, and violence, and he sometimes wondered how much longer he could endure this existence. During those long years, Marcus underwent a profound transformation that had nothing to do with his circumstances and everything to do with his perspective. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined him for so long gradually dissolved, replaced by humility and compassion. He befriended other homeless individuals, sharing what little he had and listening to their stories without judgment. Each person he met had their own tragedy, their own series of misfortunes that had led them to the streets. He met veterans suffering from PTSD, single mothers who had lost everything to medical bills, people with mental illnesses who had fallen through the cracks of the healthcare system, and addicts fighting demons they could barely understand. Marcus learned their names, remembered their birthdays, and mourned when some of them disappeared or died. The experience of living on the streets gave Marcus insights he never could have gained in his corner office. He saw the casual cruelty of people who stepped over sleeping bodies, the contempt in the eyes of police officers who moved homeless people along from one location to another, the indifference of a society that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. But he also witnessed extraordinary kindness. The restaurant owner who set aside leftover food each night, the young nurse who treated their wounds at a free clinic, the college students who volunteered at shelters, and the ordinary citizens who stopped to talk to them as human beings rather than obstacles. These acts of compassion sustained Marcus's faith that goodness still existed in the world, even if he had contributed so little to it during his years of wealth and power. Marcus developed routines and strategies for survival. He knew which libraries had the most lenient policies and would let him sit for hours, warming himself and reading newspapers. he discovered that certain parks had public restrooms that were reasonably safe. He learned to keep his possessions minimal and hidden after being robbed twice of what little he had. He found a spot near a busy shopping district where foot traffic was heavy and people were more likely to spare change. Through all of this, Marcus never stopped thinking about his past life, not with longing for the wealth and status he had lost, but with growing awareness of the terrible person he had been. The memory of George Martinez haunted him particularly, a symbol of all the people he had hurt through his callousness and greed, and he prayed sometimes that the old janitor had found better employment and that his family was well. On a Tuesday afternoon in spring, Marcus sat in his usual spot near the entrance to the upscale shopping district. The weather was pleasant, and the streets were crowded with people enjoying the sunshine. Marcus had positioned himself carefully, not blocking the sidewalk but visible enough that people might notice him. His cardboard sign was propped beside him, and his coffee cup contained a few dollars and some change from the morning's panhandling. He had learned not to expect much, to be grateful for whatever he received, and to endure the indifference and occasional hostility of passers-by with patience. Around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus noticed a well-dressed elderly man walking toward him. There was something familiar about his gait, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite his age. As the man drew closer, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Even with 8 years having passed, even though the man now walked with a slight limp and his hair had gone completely white, Marcus recognized him immediately. It was George Martinez, the janitor he had fired so callously on that morning that now seemed like a lifetime ago. George was wearing a nice suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and seemed to be heading toward the office building that towered above the shopping district. For a moment, Marcus considered turning away, hiding his face, or simply fleeing before George could recognize him. The shame was overwhelming. Of all the people who might see him in this degraded state, George Martinez was perhaps the one he feared meeting most. But Marcus was too old and too tired to run, and perhaps some part of him believed he deserved to face the man he had wronged. He watched as George approached, expecting him to walk past without recognition or to recognize him and deliver some well-deserved reproach for his past cruelty. Instead, George stopped a few feet away, his eyes widening with surprise, and then something else. Was it recognition, or compassion, or perhaps a mixture of both? "Marcus Thornfield?" George said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Marcus nodded slowly, unable to meet George's eyes. "Yes," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and shame. "It's me." George stood there for a long moment, studying Marcus's haggard face, his tattered clothes, his trembling hands clutching the coffee cup. The silence between them stretched out, heavy with history and unspoken words. Marcus expected anger, expected George to walk away or to say something cutting about karma and justice. Instead, George did something completely unexpected. He sat down beside Marcus on the cold pavement, setting his briefcase aside, seemingly unconcerned about his expensive suit or what passers-by might think. "Tell me," George said simply, his voice gentle and without accusation, "how did you come to be here?" And for the first time in 8 years, someone asked Marcus about his story not with voyeuristic curiosity or judgment, but with genuine concern for his well-being. Marcus felt tears begin to stream down his weathered face as he prepared to tell George everything. Marcus told George everything, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of confession and remorse. He described his trial and conviction, his years in prison, his release into a world that had no place for him, and his long descent into homelessness. He spoke of the daily humiliations and struggles, the cold winters and dangerous nights, the hunger and illness and despair. But more importantly, Marcus spoke of his transformation, of how the loss of everything had finally taught him what truly mattered in life. He apologized profusely for his treatment of George, his voice breaking as he recalled that morning when he had fired him so callously over a minor mistake, never considering the human cost of his actions. George listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful and compassionate. When Marcus finally fell silent, exhausted from the emotional unburdening, George was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I won't lie to you, Marcus," he said. That day you fired me was one of the worst days of my life. I went home and cried. My wife held me while I sobbed like a child. We had less than $1,000 in savings. My wife's medical bills were mounting, and our daughter was halfway through her junior year of college. I thought we would lose everything. Marcus closed his eyes, the pain of hearing the consequences of his actions almost unbearable. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so deeply sorry." George continued, "I was angry at you for months. I couldn't understand how someone could be so cruel, so dismissive of another person's life and livelihood. But here's what happened next, and I need you to understand this." George's voice took on a different tone, almost grateful despite the pain of the memory. 2 weeks after you fired me, I was hired by a small janitorial company owned by a kind man named Thomas Wu. Thomas was expanding his business and needed experienced supervisors. I started as a cleaner, but he saw my work ethic and attention to detail. Within 6 months, he promoted me to supervisor. Within 2 years, he made me operations manager. And last year, when Thomas decided to retire, he offered to sell me the company at a price I could afford, with terms I could manage. Marcus stared at George in amazement. "You own the company?" he asked, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. George nodded, a slight smile on his weathered face. "Martinez Cleaning Services. We have 40 employees now and contracts with several major buildings in the city, including the one I just came from." He gestured toward the office tower behind them. "We're doing well. My wife's medical bills are paid. My daughter graduated from college and is now a teacher. My son is in his 2nd year of medical school. I'm not rich by any means, but we're comfortable, and I'm proud of the work we do and how we treat our employees." George paused, looking directly at Marcus. "None of that would have happened if you hadn't fired me that day. Your cruelty, as much as it hurt at the time, pushed me out of a job where I had stayed too long out of fear of change. It forced me to find something better, to take a risk I otherwise wouldn't have taken." Marcus didn't know how to respond to George's revelation. He felt relief that his actions hadn't destroyed George's life, but also confusion about why George was being so kind to him now. "I'm glad things worked out for you," Marcus said quietly. "You deserved better than how I treated you. You deserved better than I ever acknowledged when you worked for me." The two men sat together on the sidewalk as people hurried past, some glancing at them curiously, others deliberately looking away. The spring sun was warm on their faces, and for a moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of human connection, of being seen and acknowledged as a person rather than an obstacle or a beggar. After a long silence, George spoke again. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. When I first saw you sitting here, my immediate reaction was shock. Then, I'll admit, there was a moment of satisfaction, a sense that karma had caught up with you, that justice had been served. But that feeling passed quickly, replaced by something else. You see, my faith has taught me that we're all broken people in need of grace and redemption. I've made mistakes in my life, hurt people in my own ways, even if not on the scale you did. And I've been forgiven for those mistakes by people who had every right to turn away from me. How can I refuse to extend that same grace to you?" Marcus felt tears streaming down his face again. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "I was terrible to you, and to so many others. I destroyed lives, hurt families, and cared only about money and power. I deserve to be where I am." George nodded slowly. "Maybe you do deserve it," he acknowledged. "I'm not going to tell you that you don't. But here's the question that matters. Does deserving it mean you should stay here forever? Does one set of mistakes, even terrible ones, define you for the rest of your life? Or is redemption possible? Is change possible?" Marcus had no answer, having given up hope of redemption long ago. George stood up, brushing off his suit pants, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a business card and a pen, wrote something on the back, and handed it to Marcus. "This is the address of my office and my personal cell phone number," George said. "I want you to come see me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. No, don't argue," he added as Marcus opened his mouth to protest. "Just come. We'll talk about what happens next. I can't promise anything specific, but I believe that everyone deserves a second chance, even people who didn't give others that same courtesy. Especially those people, actually, because they need to learn what grace looks like. George picked up his briefcase and began to walk away, then turned back. Oh, and Marcus? Take this. He pulled several bills from his wallet, at least $100, and pressed them into Marcus's hand. Get a hot meal. Find a place to shower if you can. Get a decent night's sleep. Tomorrow is a new beginning, if you're willing to accept it. Marcus arrived at Martinez Cleaning Services the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, having spent some of George's money on a shower at a gym, a haircut at a budget salon, and the cleanest clothes he could find at a thrift store. He was still obviously a man who had been living on the streets. The signs were impossible to hide completely, but he had made an effort to look as presentable as possible. The office was modest but clean, located in a small industrial complex on the edge of the city. A receptionist greeted him kindly and directed him to George's office, where the older man sat behind a desk covered with work orders and schedules. George looked up and smiled when Marcus entered. You came, he said, sounding pleased. I wasn't entirely sure you would. Marcus took a seat, feeling nervous and uncertain about what was about to happen. Thank you for giving me this chance, he said. I don't know what you have in mind, but I'm willing to do whatever you ask. George nodded thoughtfully. Here's my situation, Marcus. I need someone to work in our warehouse, organizing supplies, managing inventory, and helping with equipment maintenance. It's hard work, physical work, and the pay isn't great, $16 an hour to start. But it's honest work, and it comes with health insurance after 90 days. I can also help you find a room to rent in a safe boarding house I know. It won't be fancy, but it'll be clean and warm, and the owner is understanding about people trying to get back on their feet. Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. A job, healthcare, and housing assistance. It was more than he had dared to hope for in years. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. After everything I did to you, why would you help me? George leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. Several reasons, he finally said. First, because my faith commands it. Jesus taught about forgiveness and helping the least among us, and I try to live that teaching, even when it's difficult. Second, because I've learned that hurting people hurt other people. You were clearly a hurting person when you fired me, even if you couldn't see it at the time. Your pain manifested as cruelty and arrogance, but it was pain nonetheless. And third, because I believe in redemption. I believe people can change, can become better than they were. You've been punished enough, Marcus. You've lost everything and spent years suffering on the streets. The question now is, what comes next? More suffering, or a chance to rebuild and become someone different, someone better? Marcus accepted the job offer, his hands shaking as he signed the paperwork. The work was indeed hard. His body, weakened by years of inadequate nutrition and the harsh conditions of street life, ached constantly during those first weeks. He loaded and unloaded cleaning supplies, organized storage shelves, maintained equipment, and did whatever was needed. His co-workers were mostly immigrants and young people working their way through school, and they treated him with cautious courtesy once they learned he was new. George had not shared Marcus's history with the staff, allowing him a fresh start without the burden of his past reputation. The boarding house George helped him find was basic but clean, with a shared bathroom down the hall and a small kitchenette on each floor. Marcus's room contained a single bed, a dresser, a desk, and a small window that looked out on an alley. To him, after years on the streets, it was paradise. He cried the first night he spent there, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a clean bed, a locked door, and a roof that didn't leak. Slowly, week by week, month by month, Marcus began to rebuild his life. He opened a bank account, established a routine, learned to budget his modest income, and started to dream again, not of wealth and power, but of simple stability and the possibility of making amends for his past. 2 years passed. Marcus continued working at Martinez Cleaning Services, and George gradually increased his responsibilities and pay as he proved himself reliable and hardworking. Marcus studied for and obtained his GED, having never completed his formal education despite his previous corporate success. He began attending a support group for formerly incarcerated individuals, where he shared his story and listened to others struggling with re-entry. He volunteered at the homeless shelter where he had once stayed, serving meals and offering encouragement to those still trapped in the circumstances he had escaped. The transformation in Marcus was complete, not the superficial change of circumstances, but a fundamental shift in his character and values. One afternoon, George called Marcus into his office. "I have something to show you," he said, pulling up a spreadsheet on his computer. "These are our numbers from the last fiscal year. We've grown significantly, and I'm getting older. I've been thinking about the future of this company, about what happens when I'm ready to retire completely." Marcus listened, unsure where this was going. George continued, "You've been working here for 2 years now. You've shown dedication, honesty, and growth. You've learned every aspect of this operation. More importantly, you've shown genuine remorse for your past and a commitment to being a better person. I've watched you volunteer at shelters, mentor other ex-convicts, and treat our employees with respect and kindness. You're not the same man who fired me 8 years ago." George paused, letting his words sink in. "I want to make you a manager, Marcus. I need someone I can trust to run operations while I step back. The pay will be better, and eventually, if things continue as they have been, I'd like to discuss partnership opportunities. I'm not promising anything beyond what I've said, but I want you to know that I see a future for you here, if you want it." Marcus was speechless, overwhelmed by George's continued faith in him. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "You've already given me so much more than I deserved. This is..." George held up a hand. "You've earned it, Marcus. This isn't charity or pity. It's recognition of the work you've done and the person you've become. Accept it and keep moving forward." Marcus accepted the promotion and threw himself into his new responsibilities with gratitude and determination. He thought often about the journey that had brought him to this point, from the heights of corporate power to the depths of homelessness, and now to this modest but meaningful redemption. He had lost everything he once valued and discovered in the process what truly mattered: human connection, compassion, integrity, and the opportunity to make a positive difference in other people's lives. He would never be wealthy again, would never hold power over thousands of employees, would never see his name in business magazines or be celebrated as a titan of industry. But he had something far more valuable: peace, purpose, and the friendship of a man who had every reason to hate him but had chosen grace instead. Years later, when people asked George why he had helped Marcus Thornfield, the former CEO who had treated him so cruelly, George would smile and say, "Because everyone deserves a second chance, and because showing mercy to someone who wronged you is how we break the cycle of cruelty in this world." Marcus needed someone to believe in him when he had stopped believing in himself. "I'm grateful I could be that person." And when people asked Marcus about his remarkable life story, from CEO to convict to homeless to redeemed, he would speak honestly about his failures and the grace he had received. "I was given everything," he would say, "and I squandered it through arrogance and cruelty. Then I lost everything and learned what really matters." George Martinez saved my life, not just by giving me a job, but by showing me what real strength and character look like. He taught me that redemption is possible, that our past doesn't have to define our future, and that sometimes the people we hurt the most are the ones who teach us the most important lessons about forgiveness and humanity.